we've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the two of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want, whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right, but I think I've got it about right. What that means fundamentally, just so you have some sense of how large an effect that is that if you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. So it isn't so much that industriousness makes them happy or fills them with positive emotion. That would be more extroversion, right? Because extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. It's that industrious people can't stand sitting around doing nothing. And this is speculation, but human beings are obviously always engaged in the exchange of labor, especially the reciprocal exchange of labor. And you can imagine that in a community where everyone knows everyone, the people who work hard are going to be pretty irritated on a fairly chronic basis with the people who are completely unproductive. And my suspicions are that plenty of people who were completely unproductive in the history of the evolution of our species were wiped out by people who were unhappy with their lack of productivity. And so I think, generally speaking, human beings have this sense of ethical obligation with regards to one another to share labor. And people who are conscientious really, really feel that. So they feel bad if they're not busily working on something that's productive all the time. And so the advantage to being with someone conscientious is, well, they're going to work like mad, but the disadvantage is they're going to work like mad. So, if you're looking for a partner that you want to relax with or have fun with, or who isn't uptight, then a conscientious person is probably not a very good choice. On the other hand, if you're a conscientious person and you're living with someone who's really unconscientious, that's good, because they might be able to help you relax, but you're not going to be happy with them because they don't work nearly as hard as you do. But even worse, on the orderly dimension, some of you have had roommates, and maybe you're more orderly than your roommate. What does it mean? It means you're annoyed by mess before they are. And you don't have to be annoyed by mess much before your less orderly roommate for you to be the one that's always running around picking things up. And so actually one of the things that's emerged from the psychometric analysis is that women are slightly more orderly than men. And I suspect that has something to do with the, what would you call it, inequitable distribution of housework. Because even if imagine that your proclivity is to be triggered by disorder 25 seconds before your partner's. Well, you're going to end up, it doesn't take much difference for you to be the one that's always concerned about the mess first. So anyways, and so if you're a really orderly person and you live with a disorderly person, well, good luck getting along with them. They're going to regard you as like uptight and over concerned with details and unwilling to relax, that's for sure. And they're going to regard you as, well, just a bloody mess. And how can anyone possibly live with someone like you? And so another reason why it's useful to understand your personality is because I think it gives you a better crack at finding someone that you can actually live with over the long run. And we don't know what the optimal, I don't think you want to live with someone who's exactly like you, because then both of you have the same strengths and weaknesses. And there's a bit of a problem there, right? Because maybe an agreeable person can use a bit of a disagreeable person around them to balance each other out, and vice versa, right? So we don't understand the optimal balance for long-term thriving in a relationship, but I think we do understand the fact that if you're too different in your traits, that where you're different is going to constitute a chronic source of conflict. Strange.
So what advice can you give to people who are looking to have a strong and meaningful and lasting relationship with someone?
Well, the first thing is to decide if that is really what you want.
Is that fair, do you think, to say, I want to be single forever? Do you think that's realistic or fair assessment of oneself?
I think that that's, for most people, a pathway to insanity.
Yeah.
You know, the psychoanalysts used to think that, and we all think this way in some ways, that you're sane because you're well put together. Your psyche is well structured, right? It's internal, somehow inside your head. But, and there's some truth in that, but here's a more accurate viewpoint, I think. You outsource most of your sanity because it's too complicated. And so what you do is your parents raise you to be vaguely acceptable to other people. And then you're surrounded by other people your whole life. And then every time you go off the rails a little bit, even just a little bit, people signal to you. Like you make a joke, it's not that funny and people don't laugh. And you think, oh, well, you know, I should probably rethink my sense of humor a little bit or pay more attention. Or you tell a rambling story and you notice that everyone's like lost in the distance. And so if you're civilized enough so that people don't shun you and you have people around you, then they're going to be always telling you how to not be too insane. Well, if you're alone, you drift. You drift, you know, and you'll drift in the direction of your biggest weakness. And so, you know, there are some people, maybe they're introverted and disagreeable. They're not cut out for a lot of social contact. But we're social animals, man, right to the core. And it's a suboptimal solution for the vast majority of people. I think that people are having a harder time finding, like, let's call them more permanent relationships, is because it's become increasingly easy to have fleeting, casual sexual relationships. I mean, Tinder is a revolution, right? It's a revolution in sexual behavior, and it's certainly not obvious that it's is it a social thing? Is it just technology? Is this what people want to be doing? Because you think the fleeting, in some ways,
but the technology has enabled this fleeting sexual activity.
Definitely. Okay. Definitely. And that's, but we don't want to underestimate how radical a technology that is. That's especially for men.
I do feel that deep down that all these people, men and women alike, are always longing for something more meaningful.
Well, I think that that's generally the case. I mean, you know, part of the reason for a relationship is sexual contact, obviously. Well, that's that you don't necessarily need a relationship for that, but that's not the reason to be with someone. The reason to be with someone, when there's a lot of them. So one is, well, kids who have two parents do far better, period. The data on that is crystal clear. It doesn't mean that there aren't many single parents who struggle to do a wonderful job. Right? That's not the same thing. It's an average issue. So you need, plus, it's a lot of work to have kids. You know, you kind of need to divide up the labor, especially in the first year or two, you know, because the woman is completely overwhelmed in the first year and she needs somebody around to take care of her while she's taking care of the kid, fundamentally, or at least that's the way it looks to me. So there's that. You need the stable basis for children, and it takes them a long time to mature, and they need to learn that relationships are trustworthy, right? So there's utility and stability there. But then also, you kind of want to tangle your life together with someone, you know, because you have someone to, well, it's like two ropes that are tangled together. It's stronger, especially during times of weakness. And you have two brains instead of one, and that actually turns out to be really helpful when things are complicated. And it builds a solidity into your life and a reality into your life to have someone who's along with you on this very long voyage. And so I think that deepens your life in a way that isn't really possible with fragmentary relationships as a single person.
Definitely.
And then there's more to it than that. It's like, I think of wrestling. There's this scene in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with an angel. He's wrestling with God, actually, which is quite an interesting, that's what Israel means, right? Wrestling with God. Yeah, that just blew me away when I learned it. It's so
Is that true?
The true people of
Hebrew?
Israel are those who wrestle with God.
Wrestle
Yeah,
with
it's
God.
not believe exactly. It's a whole different thing, man. It's a whole different thing.
Isn't it like fear from God? What it means? That's what I thought.
Well, it did from the work I did in the last couple of months looking at this, and I looked into it quite deeply. It does mean wrestling, essentially, and it does derive from that scene in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with God. That's when he gets the name Israel. And his hip is dislocated, right? Permanently. He has a permanent limp after that. It's no joke. But I think of marriage the same way. Like people think, well, they lived happily ever after. It's like, that's not what you want in a marriage.
Yeah.
You want someone to contend with, you know, because you learn through that wrestling, you know, like you learn where you're an idiot and where you should stop being and vice versa. So that's the spiritual aspect of marriage. It's the fact that you have to contend with someone under all sorts of circumstances, theoretically is what would you say? It's a manner of promoting psychological, or you could say spiritual growth. And it's genuine. You know, that's why marriage is a sacrament in most human communities, right? It's stamped both by the state and by the sacred authorities, because it's not just a physiological union. That's what animals do. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with the physiological union, but it has to be placed in the context of everything else a human being is. And I do think it's dreadful for people not to have that. And
do you think it's become harder for people to have meaningful, lasting relationships, or has it always been this hard? I feel like I thank God that I'm not dating now, because I feel like it seems like it's miserable out there right now.
Well, it's
to
hard.
try to meet people.
It is hard although, you know, it's easier to meet people because there's more ways of meeting them.
Right.
But the ways of meeting them are more shallow. In my clinical practice, I would say that the rise of the internet dating option has actually overall been good for people who are looking for a partner. Now, there is some speculation and some evidence that it lowers the transaction price of separation and divorce. You know, because one of the reasons you don't separate or you don't get divorced is like, well, you're going to find someone else. And if it's easier to find someone else, then perhaps you're more tempted to sever the relationship. So maybe you lose in one place where you gain in the other. But I think there are different kinds of hard that it is. You know, it's hard for couples to figure out how to manage two careers. It's hard for women to figure out how to get educated and get their career launched at the same time that they're finding a partner and having kids. Because women have this tight time frame, you know. I mean, they've got to get a lot done by the time they're mid-30s for sure. And so it's not much time, you know. It's like 15 years really from the time you're an adult. You better get at it. It's not very long.
Right.
So I think there are new challenges that have arisen that weren't there for previous generations. But previous generations had it hard in other ways.
That's very true, yeah. Like dying
like they
at
died.
50.
Yeah. Or in childbirth, for example.
I feel like people also need to like understand how to make a relationship work. Like it's not just magic. You need to kind of put in the work to make it work.
It's hard.
You need
It's
to put
challenging.
in effort and compromise a lot of times on Like if you live by yourself, you can do everything the way you would want.
Yeah.
If you live with someone else, then there's compromises to make.
Yes.
But in the long picture, it's better for you.
Well, that's it. That's it. There's sacrifices to be made in the short term.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, people have to. The effort issue is like, well, when you're in love with someone, you're going to organize your schedule and make them a priority. And, you know, that's in some ways a fleeting state, although it's not necessarily as fleeting as people think it is, but whatever. It's obviously a priority. And then you get married and, you know, you kind of get accustomed to having each other around, and then everything else is more important and the relationship drifts to the bottom. And then people get dissatisfied and they start looking for excitement and adventure otherwise. Well, you can't do that. You have to prioritize the relationship. Like my observation clinically has been for a couple to maintain their relationship without it deteriorating, they have to spend 90 minutes a week together talking about their lives, about how the house is run, about what they've all been doing to keep their stories caught up, right?
That's not really even that much.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not that much.
Yeah.
But and which is a good thing. You can actually do it. And then they need to spend at least one time having a date. And 2 is better. 1 is necessary. 2 is better. You can't aim for a lot more than that because, you know, life is very busy. And if it's going to be sustainable, it has to be realistic. But they need to make time for each other twice a week and talk in a non-romantic way, just practically about the domestic economy and about everything that's going on. And that keeps people tied to each other and updated. And so that's sort of your minimal commitment level if you don't want things to deteriorate. You want someone, I think, in a relationship that you can spar with. And it's partly because you have hard problems to solve. And if the person that you're with isn't willing to put forward their opinion, then you only have half the cognitive power that you would otherwise have. You know, and hopefully you find someone who's interestingly different from you, like not so different that you can't communicate, and you have to be careful of that, but interestingly different, and then hopefully they have the ability and the will to express their opinion, and then, well, then it's, you know, then your interest stays heightened, and there has to be that tension in a relationship. You know, people think, well, I want to get along perfectly with my partner. It's like, no, you probably don't. You just get bored, and then you go looking for trouble. And so you want a little bit of trouble in the relationship, and a little bit of mystery, and a little bit of combativeness, and the ability to exchange opinions forthrightly. And I trust her, which is a huge element. I mean, when we finally did decide to get together permanently, we were both in our later 20s. And, you know, one of the things that I had learned by that point and insisted to her about was that we had to tell each other the truth. And she took to that wholeheartedly, you know, and for better and for worse, because truths can be harsh.
Does that include, like, does this outfit make me look fat?
Yeah, well, the truthful answer to that is I don't answer questions that are likely to get me in trouble. Yeah, so...
I have a son who will answer honestly, and it's infuriating, but then I realized if you want the truth, talk to Tamara. I'll tell you.
Well, that's the thing, you know, it's useful to know.
The truth is empowering. Truth tellers are charismatic, and, you know, actually both my sons are, like, brutally honest, which is disconcerting, but I can see that it's made them very formidable, and because of people trust them and the friendships, and just it gives them and you've written a lot about this.
Well, you know, if I tell my wife that she looks good in an outfit, she knows that I mean it.
Yeah.
And so there's some utility in that.
And then if you're silent and say, I don't answer questions, that she goes and changes
it. Well, sometimes, you know, she'll say, you know, do you like this? And I'll tell her that I don't. And you know, and
no,
that doesn't necessarily
useful.
make her happy in the moment.
Right.
But if I do say I like it, she knows that I mean it. And, you know, I actually like her sense of style a lot, so it turns out that 90% of the time it's pretty easy for me to say, look, I think you look great, and mean it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, she's a fairly harsh standard bearer, too. Like, she's she's insisted that I stay in whatever reasonable physical shape I happen to be in. That was something that she's very demanding of, and I would say that it's the same from my side. And we've been good at negotiating, which is, what do you want from a partner fundamentally? What do you want and need? I mean, the first thing is that, well, hopefully, like I said, you're blessed with the fact that you find each other attractive, and I think it's very difficult for the relationship to begin or proceed or sustain itself without that. But having that, then what do you want? Well, you want someone that you can trust. You want someone that you can build a view of the future with. And you want someone that you can negotiate with. And that's very hard to negotiate with people because they have to tell you what they think. They have to know what they want or figure it out. They have to tell you what they want. They have to be satisfied when they get what they want, which is also a very difficult thing to manage. And you have to continually update that because your life goes through different stages. And
your attraction wanes, as we all know at our stage of life, not fatally necessarily.
Speak for yourself.
but you will go. I mean, you will not be 25 forever. So that has to be renegotiated.
Yeah, well, and you have to work at that too,
right.
And that's something that people also don't understand because they tend to think that, well, that all romantic interaction should be spontaneous. It's like, well, if that's your theory, then you might as well just give up right now if you're going to get married, because the only reason you can think that is because you don't have enough responsibility to make romantic entanglement virtually impossible. And what happens when you're married, especially when you have little kids, is that, and you both have a job, let's say, is you're so busy that the probability that you're going to find time for spontaneous mutual interaction decreases to zero. And so if that's what you're hoping for, then you're never going to have it. And so what you have to do is you have to make time for each other. And, if you're dating, when you're establishing a relationship, well, you put some effort into it. You decide that you're going to go out for dinner and you dress up to some degree and, you try to present yourself to each other in some halfway mutually acceptable manner. And you hope that there's going to be a positive consequence of that you're going to find each other attractive. But then people somehow think that once they're married, that the same amount of effort isn't necessary, and that's wrong. I would say more effort is necessary on the same front, and you have to think it through. It's like, if you don't want to be bitter about the intimate element of your relationship, how much time do you have to spend together each week? And my rule of thumb, sort of derived from clinical observations, is that you need to spend 90 minutes a week with your partner talking. And that means you're telling each other about your life and staying in touch, so that you each know what the other is up to. And you're discussing what needs to be done to keep the household running smoothly. And you're laying out some mutually acceptable vision of how the next week or the next months are going to go together, right? So that keeps your narratives locked together like the strands in a rope. You need that for 90 minutes or you drift apart. And you need to spend intimate time together at least once a week and probably more like twice. And that has to be negotiated. And if you don't negotiate it and if you don't make it a priority, then it won't happen in all likelihood. And then, well, then you don't have it. And that's a catastrophe because there's not that many things in life that are, intrinsically, what would you say, engaging and meaningful and pleasurable and also bonding, all of that. And if you let that go, then, well, part of you dies and part of the relationship dies. And, well, then there's always the possibility of becoming attracted by alternative entanglements, which you would do if you had any spirit left, right? I mean, that's the thing is if your relationship at home is entirely unsatisfying sexually, what are you supposed to do with that? Nothing? You're supposed to just bear it? I mean, in one way, the answer is yes, because it's your marriage. But another way is, well, what, that's all the fight you've got in you? You're going to just let the erotic element of your life die and accept everything that goes along with that because you're not willing to cause a bit of trouble to ensure that it's maintained? And, and we're not very good at thinking these things through consciously. And people are bad at negotiating, period, as far as I can tell. But they're particularly bad at negotiating things that are deeply private. How much do you want your partner to know about you anyways? It takes a lot of trust to have a real conversation about what you need and want.
How do you find, on that topic, the love of your life?
That's a good question. I was asked that multiple times on my tour, 3 times in a row, in fact, because we asked people to use this Slido gadget.
That's a popular question.
It always came up to the top. And I got asked that 3 times in a row, and I didn't have a good answer. And then I thought, why don't I have a good answer? I thought, oh, I know why. Because that's a stupid question. So why?
Yeah.
Why? Because it's putting the cart before the horse. Here's the right question.
Mm-hmm.
How do I make myself into the perfect date? You answer that question, and you will not have any problem answering the previous question. It's like, what do I want in a partner? If I offered everything I could to a partner, who would I be? You work on that. Ask that question. Just ask. Just ask yourself, okay, I have to be the person that women would want. Okay, what do they want? Clean. That's not a bad start. Reasonably good physical shape. So healthy, productive, generous, honest, willing to delay gratification. So you dance with a woman. It's like, what's she doing? What are you two doing? Well, it's a pattern. There's patterns happening around you. That's the music. Patterns of being. That's the music. Now, can you align yourself with the patterns of being gracefully? That's what she's checking out. And then can you do that with her? And then can you do that in a playful and attentive manner and keep your bloody hands to yourself for at least a minute? And so, can you dance in a playful manner? It's like you can go through this in your imagination and you'll know. And then you think, well, how far am I from those things? And the answer is usually, man, it's a pretty horrible abyss separating you from that ideal. But the harder you work on offering other people what they need and want, the more people will line up to play with you. And so it's the wrong question. It's like, how can I be the best partner possible? And then you think, well, if I do that, people will just take advantage of me. And that's the non-naive objection, right? Because the naive person's saying, well, I'll be good and everyone will treat me right. It's like the cynic says, no, I'll be good and someone will take me out. And then you think, well, what do you do about that objection? And the answer is, well, you factor that in. And that's why you're supposed to be, what is it? As soft as a dove and as wise as a serpent. It's like, I know you're full of snakes. I know it. Maybe I know it more than you do. But we'll play anyways. And
Take the risk anyway.
That's right. Voluntarily, right? It's like, and what's so cool about that is that even though the person you're dealing with is full of snakes, if you offer your hand in trust and it's real, you will evoke the best in them.
Yeah.
And that's true. Even I've dealt with people who were pretty damn criminal and pretty psychopathic and sometimes dangerously so. And you tread very lightly when you're dealing with someone like that, especially if they're intoxicated. And even then, your best bet is that alert trust. It's the only thing I know that, like, I had one client who was he was paranoid psychopath. That's a bad combination. He was a bad guy, man. He had like 4 restraining orders on him. And restraining orders don't work on the sort of people that you put restraining orders on. And he used to be harassed now and then by, a bureaucrat in a bank with delusions of power. And he would say to them, he used to kind of act this out to me when I was talking to him. He'd say, I'm going to be your worst nightmare. And he meant it.
Yeah.
And he would do it. He had this obsessional, psychopathic vengeance that was just like right there, paranoid to the hilt. And paranoid people are hyper acute. So they're watching you for any sign of deceit or manipulation. And they're really good at it because like they're 100% that's what paranoia is. It's 100% focus on that. And even under those circumstances, if you step carefully enough, you can avoid the axe. That's a good thing to know if you ever meet someone truly dangerous.
Absolutely. I believe in that being fragile, nevertheless, taking that leap of trust towards another person, even when they're dangerous, especially when they're dangerous. If you care, if there's something there in those hills you want to find, then that's probably the only way you're going to find it, is taking that risk.
That's actually why people get married, just so you know. Because this is built into marital vows. I'm not leaving, ever, no matter what. It's like, okay, well, that definitely puts a boundary around our arguments, right? Because I can't say every time you manifest one of your flaws, which you're likely to do just as often as me, well, enough of this. It's like, that's horrible, man. If your whole life is, well, every time you get out of line, I'm out of here. It's like, how the hell are you? First of all, you're not going to admit to ever doing anything wrong. Second, you're going to be on you're like a scared cat the entire relationship, because, well, who knows, it could just come to an end at any moment. It's like, people say, well, if the possibility of divorce is open, it makes you free. It's like, yeah, that's what you want. You want to be free, eh? Really? Really? So you can't predict anything. That's what you're after. It's a vow. And it says, look, I know that you're trouble. Me too. So we won't leave, no matter what happens. Well, that's a hell of a vow, but that's why it's a vow, right? That's why you take it in front of a bunch of people. That's why it's supposed to be a sacred act. It's like, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Everything is mutable and changeable at any moment. Well, go ahead. You live your life like that and see what you're like when you're 50. Jesus, it's dismal. 2 or 3 divorces, your family's fragmented, you've got no continuity of narrative. It's not good for the kids, not by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's a form of voluntary enslavement, I suppose, but it's also equivalent to the adoption of a responsibility. And there's more to it than that. If you can't run away, then you can solve your problems. Because it might be, okay, well, I'm stuck with you. So how about we fix things? Because the alternative is we're going to be in a boxing match for the next 40 years. That's the alternative. So, and you think you're going to fix problems without something like that hanging over your head? There isn't a chance. You'll just avoid them, because that's what people do. It's really hard to solve problems, especially in a relationship. We're having a fight and I find out that it's, because you were abused by your uncle when you were 5 or some goddamn thing. It's like, it's very frequent that sort of thing happens. There's your partner's manifesting some weird anomalous behavior. You just can't make heads or tails of it. It doesn't seem related to what you're doing at all. They don't want to talk about it. And so as soon as you bring it up, they get mad. And then you bring it up again, they even get madder, and they tell you that you're not going to talk about that or they're going to leave. And so maybe you're really, really persistent because you're kind of a son of a bitch, and then they break down and cry, and then they have this horrible memory that comes flooding forward that's completely, you don't know what to do with it, and then you have to sort it out. It's like, you think you're going to do that unless there's a good reason? You have to know, we better sort this out or we're going to be carrying it around for the next 40 years. That maybe is enough motivation so you'll actually try hard to solve a problem. It's a lot easier to say, well, sorry, we're not going there. But then, good, you'll have it every day, every goddamn day for the rest of your life. See, there's some additional problems with divorce that people don't really grasp when they're young. Like, the idea that you can be divorced once you have children, that's kind of a stupid idea, because you can't. You can find a limited substitute for your initial freedom. But if you have kids and you try to get divorced, the probability that that's going to demolish your life is very, very high. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So one or both of you is going to come out of that poor. And your market value has declined. Let's say you're the woman who takes the kids. Your market value has declined radically. You're going to be poorer. The man, he's just as screwed because he is now an indentured servant and there's no escape from it. So it's not so bad if you can negotiate a peaceful separation, and some people can, but lots of times if you have a terrible relationship, it's not like negotiating a peaceful separation is all that easy. But if you're at each other's throats, good luck to you. I think it's roughly equivalent to having non-fatal cancer. It is not pleasant. It's a 10-year process, 15-year process. It'll cost you $250,000, and it'll tear a big chunk out of your life. And also, it will really disrupt your relationship with your kids. And you bring kids into a step-parent family, they do not do as well. Step-parents are not as good parents as biological parents, and the data on that is clear. Now, obviously, there are exceptions, because there are terrible biological parents, and there are wonderful step-parents. But if you look in aggregate, it's not that easy to care for children. You need everything you can binding you to them. And if they're someone else's children, mostly they get in the way of the person that you love, right? Well, let's say you have a child, I'll be right out. Let's say you have a child and I want to go out with you. Every second you spend with that child is the second you don't spend with me. And there's going to be a price for that. I'm not going to be happy about that. And if I have a child, you're going to feel exactly the same way. You might say, well, no, I love children. It's like, yeah, sure you do. I doubt it. You might love your child. And it's pretty specific the way that people love children. So, and the rate of abuse for kids in step-parent families is way higher than it is in biological families. There's not even any comparison.
You've said that a marriage must be based on trust and transparency and being shackled together. How and for how long should you get to know someone? How to set a foundation? Oh, well, there's no simple answer to that. I think that you should know someone well enough so that you know if you can negotiate with them, and so that you have started to formulate a vision of your joint future that you can both look forward to with enthusiasm and confidence. So, and of course that's going to depend to some degree on your level of maturity, but that means you've considered such things as, do you have a sufficient number of joint interests, and are you oriented in the same direction with regards to how you're going to handle your joint careers and the possibility of children, and the manner in which you're going to interact with your in-laws. And you have to start thinking about, you have to start considering your life together from the perspective of practicality and economics, I would say. So it can't just be that massive erotic attraction that's associated with love, although I think that's extraordinarily important, and you're unbelievably fortunate if you have that, and you should do everything you can to maintain it, and that takes effort. That takes real effort and will. But you need to ally that with maturity and intelligence, and the maturity and intelligence is, okay, we're going to put our lives together. What's that going to look like at the level of detail? How are we going to handle our finances? Where are we going to live? What are our joint plans going to be, etc. One of the things that my business partners and I plan to do in what would you say, that in as an analog to the self-authoring suite, is that we want to develop an online program to help people negotiate their relationships. And so it would actually provide an answer to this question in a more comprehensive manner, is that imagine that if you want to set up a household with someone, then there's a lot of things that you need to get straight, and you either do that by bringing your unconscious assumptions to bear on the situation and perhaps clashing where they don't match, or you sit down like a conscious and aware and articulate couple and start to negotiate what your joint responsibilities are going to be. And so that would be, well, who's responsible for the meals and when, and what are you going to eat, and who's going to get groceries, and who's going to pay the bills, and who's going to do which part of what household chores there are to do, and how is that going to be laid out fair. And so you should get to know the person that you're with well enough so that you can start discussing the real practical issues of life and determine whether or not you're capable of negotiating that. And I don't think that necessarily means that you should live together, because the evidence is actually quite strong, at least the last time I looked, that people who live together are more rather than less likely to be divorced. Now that might have nothing to do with the actual act of living together. It might be that people who are more likely to get divorced are also those who are more likely to merely live together. But I don't think that's a great solution for reasons I won't get into now. And with regards to being shackled together, is that's a complicated one. And I learned this at least in part from reading Carl Jung. And the idea there is that unless you've really made a commitment to someone, like a lifetime commitment, and that's a serious commitment, one that you're not going to back out of, you're not going to take the relationship with the seriousness that's necessary to make it of the highest possible quality and sustainability across the course of your life. And it's really important that it is of that high quality and sustainability, because the relationship, especially when it starts to produce children, is a machine, let's say, a machine that you jointly operate that adds immensely to the quality of your life and the depth of your life. I mean, you have the rope and strand of your life, and your partner has the strands and the rope of his or her life, and then those are tied together to make a stronger rope, and then that unites you across time, and then you undertake massive adventures together. And some of that is the establishment of a household and the establishment of joint careers and the maintenance of each other's mental and physical health and the maintenance of a high quality sexual life and all of that. Very, very challenging to do all of that. And then the joint production and care of children, which sets you up properly for the last half of your life. So like, I'm 55 now, and both my kids just got engaged in the last month. So that's pretty bloody amazing. And they're both setting up households, and they're stepping into adulthood, and I'm fortunate enough to have them in the city that I live in. So hooray for me. That's so bloody fortunate that I can hardly believe it. I mean, we've helped them out and tried to make it, what would you say, to make the possibility of their living here be something that's viable. But I'm absolutely thrilled that they're going to be around, and I'm looking forward immensely to having grandchildren. And like, what else are you going to do when you're 55? And you're going to be 55, I might have 40 more years. Like, what am I going to do with those years? Well, so I have a good marriage, thank God for that, and that's partly due to the outstanding moral quality of my wife, who I'm also extraordinarily attracted to. And we've built a life together, and we've had kids together, and we're happy with our kids. And we've had plenty of struggle with our kids, because one of our children, my daughter, had serious health problems, which she seems to have managed to resolve, partly as a consequence of her own brilliance. But we've set ourselves up now so that our children are respectable and mature young adults, so thank God for that. And they've got partners who we both really like, and they're going to have children, and well, hooray, that means that this next part of my life is going to be something that I can advance into with a fair bit of hope and excitement. And the idea of having little kids around again is thrilling, because I really like little kids. They're really, really fun. And so the shackled together is more like it's such a, I may have even said that, but it's such a cynical way of looking at it. It's more like what you've produced is an unbreakable bond between two beings, and that makes both of them better in every way if it's a relationship that's based on trust and genuine communication. It's a very difficult thing to attain, because you have to be willing to tell the truth, and the truth is generally a horrible thing. I mean, it's easy to tell truth when everyone wants to hear what you have to say, but it's very difficult to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it, least of all yourself. And so marriage gets a very bad rap in our culture, and so does child rearing. And I think that's absolute catastrophe, because really, being in a long-term relationship, a marriage, let's say, and having children, that's 2/3 of your life. Even if you're a highly career-oriented person, that's 2/3 of your life. And I'm a highly career-oriented person, and my family has been unbelievably important to me, and has also been something that's enabled me to be very effective in my career, because my house has been a sanctuary for me, and thank God for that, especially many times in my life, but especially over the last year. So you should get to know someone long enough to know that you two can tell the truth with each other, communicate and negotiate, because the most important part of a relationship is the fact that you can tell each other the truth and negotiate.
It's a great thing to know with people, like in your relationships. Here's the key to a good relationship. It's not the only one, but You watch your person carefully, carefully, carefully. And whenever they do something that you would like them to do more of, tell them that that was really good. And mean it. And it's not manipulative, because if it's manipulative, it won't work. It's like you have to say, wow, I'm so glad you did that. And you have to be precise. Here's what you just did that I thought was great. And oh boy, that's so nice that you noticed. I can't believe that you noticed. It's like, you know, you do that 20 times and the person will be like the rat that's just pushing the lever for cocaine, you know. So, but no, I'm serious. It's Skinner established this. B.F. Skinner noticed this a long time ago. Reward is intensely useful in terms of modifying behavior, but the problem is that it's really hard to notice when things are going right, because you're kind of primed to notice when things are going wrong, and so you use threat and punishment more often as agents of shaping the people that you're around, because, you know, when everything's going right, it's like, what are you going to say? Everything's going right. It turns to zero. You just assume it, and that's not good. That's not good. You want to pay attention, and if your person, your children, your wife, your whoever, your mother, your sister, if you want to rectify your relationships with them, and I'm not saying to do this in a manipulative way, it won't work. But if they do something that's promoting harmony and peace and goodwill, it's like, attend to it, tell them that you noticed. It's like, it's so useful, and you have to get rid of your grudges and your resentment to do that, right? Because you're kind of mad at your sister, and then you notice she does something good. You think, there's no goddamn way I'm going to reward her for that. So you ignore her when she does something good. It's like, that's brilliant, that is, because then you've just punished her for doing what you want. And people do that with their kids all the time, you know, because they let the kids dominate them. Then they get resentful. Then the kid will run up to them to show them something that's kind of spectacular, and they're not happy. They're like, oh yeah, that's, you know, I'm working. You know, little kid is all sad about that, and he's just learned something. So, and it's not perhaps what you want him to learn. And so you have to keep your relationship with your children pristine, and that means that you can't hold a grudge or resent them, and that means that you have to help them learn how to behave so that you like them. And that way, if you like them, and you're kind of sensible, and maybe your partner also likes them, so, you know, you got a consensus going there, there's a reasonable possibility that other people will actually like them too, including other children, and then the world will open up to them. You know, then you'll bring them to people's houses, and the people will actually smile at them and give them a pat on the head, instead of thinking, oh my God, that brat's coming to visit again, I wonder what he'll break this time. You know, and that's just a horrible thing for your child to experience repetitively in situation after situation. All they learn is that adults have a false smile, but they're really lying all the time. God, it's like a bit of hell, and there's a lot of children who are trapped in that. It's really awful to see. I can see kids like that when I walk down the street, you know, it's like they're little doomed things, and there they are, and you know, they're screwed in 15 different ways, and there's no way out of it. It's really awful. So I would not recommend that you do that. It's better to notice that you're a bit of a monster, or a lot of a monster, and notice that you are much happier with the people around you when they behave in accordance with reasonable social norms, and then you actually feel genuinely connected to them, and you want to work on their behalf so that everything works out. But if you think you're a good person and that you'd never do anything that was harmful to your children, then you can just forget about that, because you'll never take it seriously enough to actually learn. There's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. And I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you, because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young, you know, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. You know, like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. Not that plumbers, I'm not putting plumbers down. It's like more power to plumbers. They've saved more lives than doctors. So, hygiene, right? So, you know, if you're a really good plumber, well then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart. So that's very wise thing to know. So, yep. Sacrifice. And we'll talk more about that too. You get to pick your damn sacrifice. That's all. You don't get to not make one. So you're sacrificial whether you want to be or not. That's a good thing to know as well. So even though it's rather, it's a rough thing to figure out. You can go to university to not be something instead of going to university to be something. And it's Pleasure Island. And the price you pay for it, especially in the US, is debt. And you're enticed into it because the administrators can pick your pocket. So they rob your future self while allowing you to pretend that you have an identity. Right? Very nasty. And you can't declare bankruptcy with your student loans in the US. It's indentured servitude. And it's precisely Pleasure Island. It's exactly that. And so tuition fees have shot way out of control. And part of the reason that universities don't make more demands on their students and let them get away with all the things they let them get away with is because they're basically, why the hell would you chase them out? They're $100,000 or more. So they can do whatever they want as long as you get to sell them to the salt mines. Right. So, and it's not the only reason, because the other thing that's happened is that the rate of technological transformation is so fast now, and the rate of turnover of things is that it is genuinely harder for people who are, say, 18 to 20. When I was a kid, roughly speaking, the kind of rough patch for life was probably 14 to 17, something like that. Now I think it's 18 to 25. Something like that. And I think the reason for that is that all the jobs that the bloody hippies complained about being doomed to in the 1960s have now disappeared. Their problem was, oh my God, I'm going to go have to work for a corporation and get a salary for the rest of my life. And then I'll just end up in it with a pension and that'll be my whole life. It's like, well, it seems like a lot better deal than an endless round of part-time Starbucks jobs. So, some of it is that. It's there's a space now in our culture that is lacking for people to make that transformation from adolescence into adulthood. And so it's the cost of that is forestalled. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing.
Do you think this is affecting employers maybe in choosing younger people for a job? Maybe saying that they're seeing this slower maturation, or they're saying that this person's got a degree from U of T, but I've heard bad things, that degrees aren't worth it.
Well, there's a couple of problems with the degrees, is that everyone has one. That's the first one. Because scarcity matters, obviously. the second thing is that the match between the degree and the workplace has become less and less self-evident. You know, what should happen when you go to university is you should learn how to think and formulate arguments. You should learn to think, speak, and write. That's what the humanities are for. They're to make you dangerous, right? Because if you can think and speak and write, you're deadly. In a complex job, you're exactly what's necessary. But if you don't have that, it's like, what the hell good is the degree? So, I mean, degree in English literature doesn't prepare you for a job. It could make you think, write, and speak, which prepares you for any complex job, and that's what's supposed to happen. But increasingly, I think that doesn't happen. And the employers are waking up to this very rapidly. So, and they've already known that for most complex positions, they have to train their people. Now they're thinking, well, why do I have to bother with the degree if I'm going to train them, if it isn't bringing anything of value? You see this even in fields like law. We also seem to be tightly selected for the capacity to cooperate and compete, so that multiplies our cognitive ability. That's a huge part of it. And then we also seem to have constructed ourselves, so to speak, through sexual choice into these general purpose problem solving creatures. And so we've internalized some of the Darwinian process. So you think, well, most animals will produce variants of themselves physically, and then most of those variants die. But human beings have built a mechanism, let's say, that's like a game engine. I think that's a really good, you know how there are game engines now that people have devised, they're computational devices, and you can take a game engine and you can generate games with it, like computer games. So the game engine is a mechanism for producing games. Well, that's what our brains are like. Our brains are game engines for producing games. And so what happens is that when you think, you produce an avatar of yourself, you produce a fictional world that avatar inhabits, and maybe you produce multiple fictional worlds and multiple avatars. That's the you that could be tomorrow, which is what you're doing when you're planning. And you walk the avatar through its potential routes, and those that look good you keep, and those that don't look good you kill. And so then you can embody the ideas that you keep and act those out, and hopefully the idea is that when you embody them, you're successful and you don't get killed. And so we've also when we've been selecting each other for cognitive prowess, we've been selecting ourselves for the ability to generate avatars out of ourselves and kill them instead of dying. It's unbelievably brilliant. And that's really akin to the human discovery of the future, right? The future is a place where variants of you could exist. It's something like that. And other animals don't seem to be able to do that. So we're very sneaky, and well, so far it doesn't seem to be working too badly, although we haven't been around for very long, right? I mean, human beings of our particular subspecies, about 150,000 years, something like that, which is, from an evolutionary time frame, it's nothing, you know. It's 2,080-year-old men. It's not very long. There's another way of representing it. The dragon of chaos stands for the potential that surrounds us. Inside of that, there's the unknown that you actually come into contact with, right? That's the unknown as it actually manifests itself in your world as something you don't understand, instead of just the potential for that. Because we say, look, you know perfectly well that as you're sitting here, there's all sorts of things you don't know everywhere. But where are they? Well, they're not manifesting themselves at the moment. They're only in potential. But we could have a discussion that became argumentative. And then all of a sudden, it would be as if emissaries of that unknown had entered the space. And that's the unknown that's defined in relationship to what you know. That's what you actually experience, instead of it only being potential. It's a tough thing to get because they're both unknown, right? You think, well, how can there be two different categories of unknown? Well, latent and manifest, that's a good way of thinking about it. You know, in a relationship, it's going stably, but you know that sooner or later something will come up. Okay, up. From where? Why up? Well, from beneath. Well, what do you mean beneath? Well, it's from your complex. The person you're in a relationship with is complicated and complex. That's implicit in you. It's inside your conceptual structure. That's a way of looking at it. Now and then, when there's a disagreement, it will manifest itself, and you know that. You know that there's still trouble brewing ahead in a relationship, always. And that's part of what keeps them alive. There's an interesting piece of empirical work done on this a while back. So you might think, well, what does the optimal relationship look like in terms of positive and negative emotion? You might say, well, utopia, nothing but positive interactions. It's like, no. Imagine you get people to code the interactions they have with their partner during the day. You know, you sample it. You say, was that interaction positive or negative? And then what you're trying to do is predict the longevity of the relationship. Okay, so here's the data. If it falls under 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, the relationship doesn't continue. Fair enough, too much negative. That's easy to understand. If it exceeds 11 positive to 1 negative, the relationship doesn't last. Why? No challenge. Right? What do you want from your partner? Bliss? No. No, you don't. You want periods of peace punctuated by a good fight. And that because that means you respect them, it means you have something to offer each other, and it means that you're both growing. And so you don't want the fight to be too dramatic because, well, then you retreat, you can't settle it. But the person that you can completely map and who only does positive things for you, it's like A, you don't know that person. B, they're not communicating with you, nor you with them. Maybe they're just subordinating themselves to you or you to them. And you're not growing. You want someone who can, a real relationship is a wrestling match. It's a grappling phenomena that you both emerge transformed from. And that's what people want. They don't want a pushover. Not unless there's something wrong with them. You know, a narcissistic person who never wants to be challenged will want a partner who does nothing but deliver exactly what they're told to deliver, but they will mistreat them beyond belief, and perhaps deservedly so.
What's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah. Well, okay, fine. That's the same second question. That's pretty straightforward, man. I mean, you can't eliminate the necessity of being attracted to one another. That's important, and that's mysterious, you know. So, for example, here's a funny thing. One of the things we know that attracts people to one another is bilateral symmetry. And so if you take men and you rank them by the symmetry of their faces, and then you give the asymmetrical men t-shirts to wear, clean t-shirts for a day, and the symmetrical men clean t-shirts to wear for a day, and then you give the t-shirts to women and you have them rate the odor, the women rate the odor of the symmetrical men as more attractive than the odor of the asymmetrical men. And there are other factors that determine sexual attractiveness that are based on biological factors that are that deeply embedded in terms of smell, for example. So women also tend to not be sexually attracted to the scent of men who have, if I remember correctly, it's RH factors that would make for potential trouble in childbirth. And often the reason that the women give for not preferring the scent of those men is that they smell too much like their brother, something like that. So there's weird, mysterious things that determine whether or not people are sexually and physically attracted to each other, and I think it's very important that that's part of a marital relationship. The next most important thing is trust, man. It's like there's no marriage that's successful without trust. You've got to tell each other the truth. And one of the reasons that Jung believed that marriage and an oath and Carl Jung as a bond was necessary, it's really wise. It's like, you know, telling the truth to someone is no simple thing, because there's a bunch of things about all of us that are terrible and weak and reprehensible and shameful and all of those things, and they kind of have to be brought out into the open and dealt with. And you're not going to tell the truth about yourself to someone who can run away screaming when you reveal who you are. And so the marriage bond is something like, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to handcuff myself to you, and you're going to handcuff yourself to me. And then we're going to tell each other the truth, and neither of us are going to get to run away. And so once we know the truth, then we're either going to live together in mutual torment, or we're going to try to deal with that truth and straighten ourselves out jointly. And that's going to make us more powerful and more resilient and more and deeper and wiser as we progress together through life. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because if you leave a back door open, man, you're going to use it, that's for sure. And the oath is there, and this was Jung's commentary on the spiritualization of the human pair bond by Christian marriage, for example, which emphasized the what would you call it, the subordination of both members of the marital union to a higher order personality that was embodied in the figure of the Logos. So the idea is that in the Christian marriage, for example, the man isn't the boss and the woman isn't the boss. The boss is the mutual personality composed by the seeking of truth in both of them, and that's conceptualized as their joint subjugation to the Logos. And that is absolutely dead on, man. It's like the ruler of your marital life should be your vow to tell each other the truth. Because like in hard times during your life, when you've done something stupid and idiotic that might take you down, and you don't have anybody that you can turn to, if you have a partner that you can trust, you can go say, hey, I made a big financial mistake, man, and it's really torturing me, and I feel like a complete idiot, and it's really dangerous. And the person there is going to help you figure out what to do about it. And they're going to know that when they make a stupid mistake, and they're bloody well going to, that they can come and talk to you, and that you guys are going to work your way through it. And that's a big deal. And there's a couple of things our culture gets really wrong, and one is it devalues marriage. That's really a very bad idea, because marriage is like a third of your life, and maybe more. And kids are a third of your life, and your life outside of marriage and kids is a third of your life, approximately speaking. And to miss any of that is a massive, massive mistake. Now, having said that, I will also say that for some people, missing one or more of those is necessary because they have a reason. Maybe they're brilliantly creative artists and they need to devote themselves entirely to their career, or they're outstanding in some way, and so they can justify the sacrifice of one part of that triad of being to another part. But generally speaking, it's a very dangerous thing, and it shouldn't be done. And also, kids get an absolutely terrible rap, because kids are delightful if they're well behaved. One of the chapters in my new book is called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And you can do that, especially if you discuss it thoroughly with your spouse, the person that's helping you discipline the kids. And children are the best company because they're really enthusiastic about everything. They love doing new things. They really love you, so they're happy that you're around. All you have to do is make sure they're not too hot and they're not too cold and they've had something to eat and they're not too tired, and you don't expect them to stay engaged in something for longer than they can manage. Because we used to take our kids when they were little out to restaurants, for example, and they could sit there no problem and behave really nicely when they were 2 and 3, but they couldn't do it for more than about 45 minutes. You can't push your luck. But I also noticed with little kids is that they got antsy and unreasonable about 5 to 10 minutes before the adults did too. It's just the adults were too stupid to notice. The kids would notice right away. So back to marriage. Well, you look for someone that you're attracted to, that you love, and then you look for someone that you can bloody well trust. And then you tell them the truth. And that way maybe you can get through life and you can have someone to weave the rope of your being with and together to make your joint rope stronger, and you can have some continuity in your narrative, and you can have children, and then you can have grandchildren, and like you can have a life, man, and there's nothing. You're so fortunate if you can manage that. And so, okay, so there's that one. So what's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah, well, and also, marry someone you think would be a good mother and that has enough sense, generally speaking, to know that she wants children. Now, some women don't want children, and fair enough. And some women perhaps shouldn't have children. That's also possible. But the general rule of thumb is, especially once a woman's, in her mid-20s, if she doesn't know that she wants children or won't admit it, unless she has a viciously important reason, then she's not oriented properly psychologically. She doesn't know what's important in life. Now, that might also be the case with you, and it probably is, but as a rule of thumb, that's a really good one.
I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea, this is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update, because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this has also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women, because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that the solution emerges. And I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. Is that if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual, because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing. And so all you have to do is give up your resentment and your hatred. I know that's a hard thing to give up because you have plenty of reason for it. That's probably a good place to stop. So it was a pleasure. When both of us were very ill over the last 3 or 4 years, and my wife almost died, and so did I, and all that unfolded over a period that lasted a few years, and we were apart for a lot of that. And when we came back together, we were quite distant from one another, partly because, well, I was still quite ill, and Tammy was still recovering, and, well, many things had happened in the interim, to say the least. And it wasn't a straightforward thing for us to put ourselves back together as a couple. The will was there. We had a practice of consciously dating for decades. So when we first had little kids, and this happens to people who have little kids, we found that we were separating intimately. And that's because when you're at that stage of your life and you're developing your career and you have little kids, it's like sex is priority number 11 on a priority list of 10, and you only ever get to priority 5. And so it's not that it's unimportant, it's that it becomes displaced, and that's understandable, but it's not a good medium to long-term solution. It has to be moved back up the priority list to some minimally acceptable degree, and the question is that you have to negotiate as a couple is, what is that minimally acceptable degree? And people hate having that conversation because people will act out sexual acts, say that they'll never talk about, which is a strange reality. When I was working as a clinician, I used to have these conversations with my clients, especially now and then. I would have both my client and their husband or wife in the office with me to talk over issues like this. And one of the things I would ask them, which they absolutely hated, was, well, how often should you have sex? And they would come up with all sorts of reasons to not give an answer to that question, like, well, we don't want to make it so formal, and we don't really want to take the spontaneity out of it. And it's like, yeah, really, you're having a lot of spontaneous sex, are you really? That's actually, you've been married 10 years, 15 years. There's so much spontaneous sex that you just don't want to mess with that. It's like, why are you in my office? So that's just delusional. And so, but it was still very difficult to pin either of them down, and I suppose that's because, maybe the husband says, well, 15 times a week, and the wife says once every 2 years, and that's... And neither of them want to admit that that's what they want or need, and so they won't talk about it, and so you have to corner people if you're a treacherous therapist, and the way you do that is by starting with something absurd. It's like, well, how about once every 2 years? And both of them pretty much agree almost instantly that that's probably a little on the scarce side. And then you might say, well, how about 4 times a day? And virtually without exception, although not always, both parties agree that that's probably aiming for the stars, let's say. But then now you've got people nicely trapped, because it's somewhere between 4 times a day and once every 2 years. And then you can pull in the walls. It's like, well, how about 6 times a week? Or how about once every 3 months? And, that's a lot closer, right? It's still not that close, but it's a lot closer. And generally, my experience was that people who have relatively productive and engaged and multidimensional lives settle on something varying between 1 to 3 times a week. And that's a close approximation. And I've also noticed that couples who aren't intimate physically, about once a week at minimum, things tend to deteriorate across time, and the relationship tends not to hold. And I've also noticed that unless you spend about 90 minutes a week listening to and talking to your partner about practical matters of the domestic economy and your shared life, you also build up a huge backlog of undisclosed communication, and 10 years from now that will fall on you in the form of a divorce case, and you'll spend all the time you could have been talking at home talking in court, which I wouldn't recommend. And I also think it's very difficult to get that 90 minutes or 120 minutes or whatever it happens to be a week of intimate time together unless you first sort out the 90 minutes or 120 minutes of necessary communication. But it's worth the discussion. It's like you could ask yourself first, all right, hypothetically you could have what you wanted, but first you have to admit what it is. And that's a hard thing to think through, right? Because you really got to face yourself when you ask that question, because you have to ask yourself, well, what's the minimum sexual commitment I seem to require so that I wouldn't be tempted, say, to stray? And you might say to yourself, well, I'd never be tempted to stray. It's like, never's really not the right answer in that situation, right? Because it sort of means in some sense that you're already 3/4 dead. So I don't think it's actually a moral virtue to assume that no matter what, you wouldn't be tempted to stray. And I'm certainly not saying that the temptation is a good thing or that the straying is either, but the proclivity to want to, if you're completely deprived, might be the vestiges of a virtue. It means you still got a spark inside you. And so you might say to yourself, well, I believe it would be this. This is what I seem to need and want. And then maybe your partner could ask herself or himself the same question. And then maybe you could have a discussion about it. Now that's an awkward discussion, and there's some rules for that too. It's like, be willing to talk about it 20 times and do it really badly, because you're not going to do it very well to begin with, and 20 times isn't that many. If you're going to make love to your partner, let's say 3 times a week for the next 30 years, that's 30,000 times. A dreadful proposition that is, but talking about that 20 times is probably not that much of an investment given that degree of return. So, and it is useful to allow yourself and your partner to understand that that's going to not be an easy conversation, that you're going to do it stupidly and badly.
And one of the things I used to tell my clients, encourage my clients to do, that's not tell them, encourage them to do, was to schedule dates if they were married. And their objection was always the same. It's like, well, we did that before we got married. I got married so I didn't have to do that anymore. It's like, really? That's why you got married? Did you tell your wife that before you got married? I'm going to marry you so that I never have to spend a single moment for the rest of my life ever thinking about how to be romantically interesting to you. What do you think? Shall we get married? It's like, that's generally not the offer that's on the table. And if you think that all of that romance is going to manifest itself spontaneously, it's like, well, what do you think? You're in some sort of delusional Hollywood fairy tale? It's like, that's not going to happen. It didn't happen when you were single, or if it did, it rarely happened. It's certainly not going to happen when you're married. You have to put some time and attention to it. And then you might think, well, how could we make it go so that if we put time and intention to it, it would be so clearly worthwhile that we'd never have a second's doubt about whether or not it was a good idea? And that's a good thing to aim at. And after Tammy and I were so ill and separated, we had spent a lot of time practicing dating. And we had got good at it. And that's what we had when we were recovering from death and coming back together. And that was great. That was a great thing. And you know, they say practice makes perfect. And so if you really want something, like you really want something, why not aim at it? And if you really want something and you're aiming at it, why not communicate about it? And dream. You know, you can dream together. You can think, well, if we had the romantic life we wanted, what would you want? That's something to ask your partner. What would you want? Something to ask yourself. If I could have what I wanted, that's to knock and ask, right? And to seek. If I could have what I wanted, what would it look like? You know, and then you can stumble forward stupidly and approximate getting it. And with some practice, maybe you'll get it. And what a good deal that is. And then, you know, maybe you won't be completely old and worn out by the time you're 40 and completely devoid of any interest in your partner and cynical and bitter and searching around for an alternative and carping about how appalling your wife is to your friends. And that's a pretty damn dismal alternative to a bit of dreaming and some communication. And so, and I think not only can you do that within an ethical framework, I think that if you don't do it, you're not operating within an ethical framework. So it's perfectly reasonable to pull up the sexual impulse, let's say, and elevate it to the status of the highest ethical endeavor. A strange way of thinking about it, but the alternative is just not what anyone wants.
So let's say you're having an argument with your partner, and you say, you're a stupid person, and you've always been a stupid person, and as far as I can tell, as far into the future as I can see, you're going to remain a stupid person. So what are they supposed to do? What are they going to do when you say that? They're going to cry, like if you mean it. They're going to get angry, if you mean it. And they're not going to like you very much. And why is that? Well, it's like, it's assault, basically. The only way, really, the only thing that you can do in a situation like that is walk away, ignore it, respond in kind, or it degenerates into violence. That's it. Because there's no discussion. You haven't left the person anywhere to go. You've gone right to the top of their hierarchy and said everything about you is wrong, and worse than that, all the mechanisms that we could use to correct it won't work. So those are fighting words. So don't do that unless you want to have a fight. So then you might say, well, what would you do instead? And the answer is, deliver the least amount of information you possibly can. And so let's say you come home and your person is watching TV, and you're kind of hoping they'd greet you at the door. You shouldn't break down into tears and say, you're a stupid person, you've always been a stupid person, and you're going to be a stupid person in the future. You should say, I have this peculiarity, and that is that when I come home, I don't have enough confidence to just be happy. I would like you to come and say, just shut the TV off for 2 minutes, come to the front door and say, hello, and then you can go back and watch your TV. Would it be okay if you did that? And they'll think, well, you'll have to pay for it somehow, but then they'll probably do it. And so, but the thing is you got to specify the routine that you want transformed at the highest possible level of resolution, and you want to recommend the minimal necessary change that will satisfy you. So you can't say, if you loved me, you'd know how to greet me at the door. Ha, not helpful, because they're stupid. Right, and so are you. So you have to spell it out. It's like, what do you want? Exactly, what would make you satisfied? And then you have to have your person like grudgingly practice that a few times, and you have to let them do it very badly and also in a bad temper, and then you have to reward them for it, and then maybe 3 months later they'll do it properly. So you need to know that, because that's what people are like. It's very hard for them to learn new things, and they're very resistant to it, but they're very responsive to reward. So another thing, this is partly what B.F. Skinner figured out. So when he was training rats, and he wanted a rat to do something, one of the things he would do is maybe he was going to train the rat to climb a little ladder. And I mean, he could get rats to climb ladders and then climb across like the little monkey bars and then spin around 3 times and then, whack a ball and then eat something. Like, he got incredibly complex behavior out of rats. And the way he did that was patience. So he put the ladder in the cage and the rat would just run around doing rat things, and then it would put its hand on the first rung, and Skinner would give it a pellet. And so he did, after even once, the rat's going to be like, stand in the immediate vicinity of the ladder, and then the frequency with which it's going to go like this is just increased. So then it does it again, bang, pellet. Well, soon the rat is just going like this, right? So then you wait until the rat tries the other hand. So you give it a pellet then. Well, then it's going like this. And then because it's going to get bored, it'll go like this. It'll hit the next stair. Bang, you give it a pellet. Soon the rat's climbing and doing all the little things you want it to do. Now the problem with that is you have to be patient. You have to wait till the rat does what you want. Okay, that's more relationship advice. Wait till the rat does what you want, and then reward it. And it's unbelievably useful. It's also extraordinarily positive. I mean, I'm being, comical insofar as I can manage that about the situation. But people love reward, and they love attention. People love attention more than anything else. And so, if you watch through the day, and when your partner does something that's good, say, man, that was good, or something like that. You can be inventive, and then they'll do it more. And if you do that a whole bunch, like for a year, they'll be doing things that are good for you just all the time. But you have to be patient, which is very annoying, and you have to suppress your response to only respond to negative things. Because what we know about the expectancy models is that a deviation from expectation produces a burst of negative emotions. So you come home and the whole house is clean, but there's like, I don't know, the dog has shed on the rug or something, and the person overlooked that. It's like, you're not going to see the clean house, you're going to see the rug with the dog fur on it. You're going to say, why didn't you clean up the rug with the dog fur? And they're going to say, good luck getting me to clean up the house again. And because the thing is the exception stands out, and what's done doesn't. And the reason for that is you can just ignore what's done, because it's done. It doesn't get in your way. So it gets invisible really quickly. So you really got to watch that tendency. One of the things Nietzsche said was that if you really want to punish someone, you don't punish them when they do something wrong, because they expect that. That's not a punishment. They expect that. They might even be relieved by it. You want to punish them when they do something right, because then you'll really hurt them. And so that's something to think about. If you're in a relationship, man, if someone's done something right, do not punish them. You do that 2 or 3 times, and that's it, man. You're not going to get them to do that anymore. So, judiciousness. Watch what they're doing. If something happens that's good, notice it. And, if they've done a bunch of things, don't concentrate on the things they did wrong. That's not smart. It's really hard on them, too. In some sense, this sounds manipulative and selfish, because I'm teaching you how to train your partner, but you should also teach them how to train you. Because it would be really nice if you could come home and the person would say, well, what did you do today? And you say, here's a bunch of things I did. And they say, well, this looks really good and that was great. And why don't you do some more of that? And you're like, oh boy, it was a great day. And so, you can train them to train you properly. And that's a really helpful thing, especially if you do it over a few years. That's how you have a good relationship, because you're both clueless as hell to begin with. You don't know even what would make you happy, much less what would make the other person happy. And so you got to figure these things out bit by bit, and then you have to inform each other, and then you have to be patient enough to let your partner do these things really badly. I'll give you another example. Sometimes I see couples sporadically in my clinical practice. I'm not a couples counselor. And so, but sometimes when I'm working with someone, there's an issue that needs to be discussed with both people, because otherwise it's just stupid. And one of the things I often recommend to people, especially once they have kids, is that they set aside, to use an anachronistic phrase, date nights. Well, everyone hates that idea. It's like they say, well, they'll just say I'm not doing that. That would be one objection. We're just not doing that. That's what we did before we got married. They'll say, well, my partner would never go for that. They've got a bunch of excuses why that isn't going to work. And so I've heard all those excuses. I know all of them. And then maybe I convince them, yeah, sure, I know this is stupid. It's awkward. It's artificial. That's okay, just try it once. So then they go and try it, and then they come back and they say, we had an absolutely miserable time. Really, we had a miserable time. We couldn't agree on what movie to go to, and then, she took me to her movie, and I really didn't like it, and so we fought all the way home. We're never doing that again. And I say, well, really, you've got 30 years, 400 days, that's 12,000 days. Okay, so you're not going to do that. You're going to spend the next 12,000 days without having any real romantic evenings and interactions with your spouse. That's your plan. And I like doing arithmetic with my clients. Hey, they hate that. They hate arithmetic. It's like, well, no, that sounds like a bad idea. I said, okay, well, would you like some romance in your life, or are you just done with that? Well, really, people can go for a long time with no romance at all. Say, well, no, maybe we'd like some of that. Well, how much? Once a year? Well, no. Once a month? Well, no. Once every 2 weeks? Well, sometimes people are really busy. It's like, okay, that beats the hell out of 0. Once a week, twice a week, okay, whatever. We're gonna start with a range. Okay, what would a good evening look like? Like if you could both get exactly what you wanted, what would it look like? Well, then they have to think about that, because the previous theory was, my stupid partner should know what I like, and that's what the partner is thinking too. It's like, good luck with that, because no, they don't have a clue, especially if they're men, they don't have a clue. So you have to tell them what you want and how they could deliver it, and vice versa, which is very awkward and horrible. And then you have to practice it for 6 months, because it takes a lot of practice to do something sophisticated really well. And then if you do that, it's like, poof, you got it for the rest of your life. How many chances do you think you'll have in your life for like a serious, high-quality, intimate relationship? What do you guys think? How many chances are you going to have for that?
3 to 4.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I would say you probably top out at about 5. Okay.
2 down, 3 to go.
So, okay, so, that's not that many chances. Plus, you get old quick. By the time you're 45, you're not going to have a family. And well, you can do that sometimes if you're male. If you're female, maybe, but it gets pretty rough. And you're looking probably at that point at a fair bit of in vitro and that sort of interaction. It's tough, it's hard on people. So, not only do you not have that many chances, you don't have that much time. So you got to get it right. So if you get it wrong, it costs you. Like maybe it'll cost you 5 years. 5 years is a long time. So, and 3 5-year costs is like, you've lost things there that you can't replace. Okay, so that's one part of it, is you don't have that many chances, and it's costly to burn up the time. Okay, the second thing is, a divorce is very complicated. Like, it's not so bad if you get divorced to someone who's reasonable. But often the reason that you're getting divorced is that one or the other or both of you aren't that reasonable. And what that might mean is that you might be negotiating with someone whose basic goal is to make sure that you don't have another day of success in the next 20 years. And if that's their goal, they will attain it. So, and there's lots of ways people do that, and they usually do it by holding their children hostage. And people will definitely do that. They do it all the time, you know. So, you want to avoid that. And then, you know, then of course it's hard on the relationship you have with your children. And like those are probably the most important relationships you have in your life. You know, it's like, might be parents, might be siblings, might be your partner, might be your kids. But I think when it comes right down to it, your parents are old, and so are you, but your kids aren't. And they're just as close. Plus they need you. And so you start twisting and messing that about, boy, it's hard on your psyche. It's hard on the kids too. So, you know.
So then I'm just thinking about that and what you said about how that's a cost. If you mess it up, and that's like a 5-year cost, that's a cost you, right?
Oh, and it might be a 15-year cost if you're in a custody battle, and it will cost you $250,000.
Right.
Or
let's
more.
say, yeah, but like, is it then, would you say, like being a psychologist, that it's better for people to like pursue a relationship that's like not good, to continue to do that and possibly incur further costs than it is to just cut it off? Because it wouldn't divorce be.
Okay, it's a complicated question. What I would say is, don't make the kind of mistakes that get you into such a stupid relationship to begin with. Okay, because that's the answer to that question. And the way you do that is by trying not to delude yourself any more than is absolutely necessary. And that means, when you're in the damn relationship, tell the person the truth and try to figure out what the truth is for you. And don't put up with any nonsense, and stand up for yourself. And also aim towards the good. You know, if you do all those things, then your relationship is probably going to work. If you're trying to do all those things, really, and you have a partner that will not do that, then leave. But it's a rare person who won't do that if they're stepped along the way properly and they learn how to do it. Now, not everyone's like that, because you do run into some people who are basically devoted towards mayhem and trouble. You know, but usually, you know, a person is a balance of striving for the good and, you know, messing about in the hell. And, you know, you're both like that when you start a relationship, and you try to tilt it towards the good. And then you won't run into that problem. So, but you have to do that right from the beginning of the relationship, you know. Because it doesn't take that much to corrupt a relationship so that it's not really salvageable. Enough mistakes, 3 or 4 acts of infidelity, you're done. You aren't going to come back from that, because the fundamental element of trust has been removed. And then you can't communicate with the person because you don't know if they're telling you the truth, and then you don't know if you're dealing with reality. And if you're not dealing with reality with your partner, it's like, good luck fixing that. It's like you're working on a ghost car while the real one is sitting in the shop with the motor out, you know. It's not going to get you anywhere. So a lot of the issue is, don't get in the trouble to begin with. If you are in the trouble, well, then you try to straighten yourself out and see if you can fix it. Well, if you can't, your options aren't great. And it depends on the particularities of the situation. Now, I know I have people that I counsel, it's like, leave that person. And the rule is, they're lying to you, they aren't aiming up, and you won't be able to tolerate being with them for 10 years without becoming resentful, alcoholic, and homicidal. So that's a bad outcome. There's nothing you can do to avoid it, so you might as well leave. But you know, you have to have that sorted out. It has to be the truth, because it's no fun. It's no good to leave someone who's struggling in the lurch. You know, when you think, well, I'm with this person, they're not going anywhere. You know, maybe they have an alcohol problem, and they're resentful. It's like, but I'm all they've got. Well, they bloody well better want to fix that, because you're not going to be able to fix it. All that'll happen is you'll end up in the same place. Now, if they really want to fix it, more than anything, and they're willing to tell the truth about it, and willing to interact with you, then there's a ghost of a chance you might pull through it. But it's very hard to fix someone, and it's really hard to fix someone who does not want to be fixed. And there's lots of people like that. So.
I was just going to say, like, a personal anecdote. My parents divorced when I was like 3. So I know that a lot of people say, like, you're harming the kids if you get divorced. And I've had to deal with a lot of, like, the tension between, like, choosing your parent and which one to agree with. But when everyone asks, like, are you upset that they got divorced? I'm like, I see how much they fight now, and I can't imagine having that happen, like, 24/7 and being in that household.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why there isn't an answer to the question.
Yeah.
It depends on the particularities of the situation. And so there's lots of situations where a general answer doesn't suffice. But I would say this is a tough one. I can tell you what's happened since the divorce laws got liberalized. The first thing that happens is that all of you are going to be divorced at about the same rate as people would have 30 years ago. Because rich people still get married. And they generally don't get divorced. Poor people do not get married. And that's like 60% of the population. And it's ramping up quick. And there's no evidence whatsoever that that's anything but catastrophic. So kids who are raised by single parents do not do as well. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some single parents who are doing a stellar job. Obviously there are, and there's some married parents that do a terrible job. That's not the issue. The issue is the bulk of the evidence, and the bulk of the evidence strongly suggests that children who are raised with 2 parents do better. Well, duh. Why? Well, why? It's impossible to raise children. Jesus, they're expensive, they're troublesome, they're smart, and they're useless. And you've got them for 20 years. It's like, you're going to do that by yourself? Sure you are. You're going to be working at a horrible job 40 hours a week or more, like a retail job, for example, where they just treat you like a slave. And then you're going to go home to your miserable kids exhausted. It's like, that's not fun. And it's increasingly the norm for huge chunks of our population. Like, elitist liberal types, like all of you, for example, don't pay much attention to what happens to people who are actually poor. But as far as I can tell, it's been a bloody catastrophe for them. There's an old saying, when the upper class gets a cold, the lower class gets pneumonia. And the thing about that saying, it's true. It's like, it's not a metaphor, it's literally the case. If an epidemic sweeps through a population, the population dies from the poor people upward, because they're so damn stressed. So, I would say, with regards to marriage, now I've been married a long time. It's 26 years now, and I've noticed a bunch of things about marriage. One is, 2 brains are better than 1. And so if you actually communicate with your partner, because they're not like you, it's like you have a corpus callosum between you, and they'll tell you things that you don't understand. Like when you're being stupid, in a typically feminine way, say, or a typically masculine way, or in whatever stupid way you manage to be stupid. They'll point that out to you, and that can be really helpful, even though it's extremely annoying, and they can help you make decisions, and they're a good place to confess to, and it's really helpful when you're trying to figure out how to discipline children, so that you're not a pathetic milksop who lets them run all over you, or some tyrant who, likes to beat them with a stick when they sneeze. Hopefully you kind of find some pleasant middle ground in there. And it's a lot easier to do that with 2 people than with 1. And then they can spell you off when you're exhausted. Particularly useful if you have small children, because you will be exhausted when you have small children. Plus the narrative of your life has continuity. And that's nice. And if your home is set up properly, it's actually a pleasure to go to it. It is a buttress against the chaotic and uncaring external world, because the external world, in many ways, doesn't give a damn about you. So if you go home and it's set up reasonably well, it's like, hey, you've got somewhere to belong. That's not so bad.
Just another related situation that has personal relevance for me and for other people too. Is that in many situations, like when something bad happens, okay, yeah, I've got to do some kind of reparative thing, right? And so say it's like a health scare, you go, okay, I've got to work on my diet. And then it's a divorce, it's like, all right, well, I gotta work through why I didn't think I was headed for a divorce for the last 20 years, but now it just happened. But in some situations, people know they gotta repair, but they don't wanna get something that would actually be repairing, so they go to people who are specialists in like other areas of like personal, psychological dealings and stuff like that, anything but divorce. Like attention deficit, work on your attention skills, or like work on these, or like assertiveness training or something like that. But like they're diligently avoiding the heart of the matter. And
Well,
what would you
okay.
make of that? And if you were in a family with somebody like that, is there something you can do?
Well, you know, some situations are like Humpty Dumpty, right? There's no putting it back together.
Yeah.
Now, but again, in terms of avoidance of those situations, it's like you think about that hierarchy again. Well, divorce is a low resolution, high impact solution because it just tears a chunk of that hierarchy out and throws it away. That's a lot and it's costly.
Yeah.
It's going to hurt you. Okay, so then you think, well, what might you do instead of that? And the real answer is solve the damn problems as they arise. You know, and that's hard and it requires drilling down. It really requires drilling down. So one of the things I want to build, for example, which I haven't built yet, it's kind of like going to be like this future authoring thing that you guys do. I want to build a problem-solving matrix for couples. Because here's how not to get divorced from your wife. Figure out how to set the table properly. Now, what does that mean? It's really, really complicated. It's like, who's going to cook? When are they going to cook? Why are they cooking? How should you respond to it? Who buys groceries? What are the groceries going to be? Who's going to put them away? How do you say thanks when someone does something for you in the domestic environment? And what's happened, and this is part of the death of God, roughly speaking, is that the roles are gone. Okay, and what that means is you better be awake. Because it turns out that running a kitchen in a house is unbelievably complicated and difficult. And so you have to negotiate how to do it. And you're a terrible negotiator. You don't know how to decompose the damn problem to the point where you could solve it. You won't admit what you want. You won't admit what you're like. You won't pay any attention to what actually irritates you. You know, so you like to think that you're nice and easy to get along with, but you're not. And so, you know, I treat people who have post-traumatic disorder or symptoms of post-traumatic disorder. And so let's say they got post-traumatic stress disorder because a relationship collapsed on them suddenly, which is quite common. You know, they get betrayed or someone leaves them suddenly and then they don't know what to do because, especially if they're conscientious, because then they just tear themselves into pieces trying to figure out what they did wrong to bring about that event. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to retool their perceptions and their actions so that the probability that they'll have the same experience again is minimized. And their mind won't leave them alone until they do it. And no wonder, right? Because if you fall into a big pit and you get really hurt, the first thing you should figure out is how to not fall into big pits anymore. And your mind is set up exactly for that. And so what you do with someone who's having problems like that, so maybe they're waking up at the middle of the night obsessing about what went wrong, is you walk them through it. You do a situational analysis first, because one of the oversimplifications that people make, and this is especially true for conscientious people, is if something bad happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. Now that's actually a pretty functional idea because it suggests that there are things about your behavior that you could change that would make the future better. But the problem is that, say if it's the collapse of a relationship and you've been with that person for 8 years or longer, well, you did so many things with them that the idea that you did something wrong pretty much extends to every single thing you ever did with them. And that's, how are you going to fix that? And so that's part of the trauma, actually. The trauma is 80 million snakes all at the same time. It's like, well, forget it. You don't have time to go through all that material. And so partly what you do is with people, and this is what you should do with yourself too, is you do a situational analysis. It's like, don't be assuming necessarily that the thing that happened to you only happened to you because of what you did or didn't do. There's all sorts of factors at play. So one of the things that sometimes I do with clients is if they were in a relationship and I can get
some reasonable personality information about both of them, I can point out where they were temperamentally incompatible. You know, like if you're a highly conscientious person and your partner is very, very low in conscientiousness, it's like, well, good luck to you two. How the hell are you ever going to work that out? Because you want everything to be exactly where it's supposed to be, and you're working all the time, and your partner could care less whether things were where they're supposed to be, and they're not going to work. And you can butt heads about that forever. The probability that you're going to shift it, you know, except to some minor degree, is very, very low. And so sometimes you end up with someone with whom you get along very well on one temperamental dimension, and you're an absolute catastrophe on the other four. And the probability that you're going to be able to mediate a huge temperamental difference is extremely low. You wouldn't expect yourself to mediate a huge intellectual difference, right? You're going to make the other person smarter, or maybe you smarter, depending on who you're with. It's like, no, probably not. A bit, maybe. So you do a situational analysis. And so what you're trying to do is to extract out information from your past and your present that will enable you to conduct yourself properly into the future. And so that's another example of the pragmatic element of thought. Well then, within the brain itself, apart from the major subdivisions which we just described, there are minor subdivisions, and here's a bunch of them listed: the caudate nucleus, the cerebral cortex, the huge newest part of the brain that's about a square meter. If you unfold it, it's all folded up, and most of the processing occurs right on the surface. That's the idea anyways. The thalamus, that's a place where a lot of the information in the brain appears to be integrated. The cerebellum helps you with balance and the sequencing of complex motor activities. The hippocampus, that's the one we talked about before. One of the things that the hippocampus seems to do is compare your model of the world as it's unfolding with the model that you desire to be occurring, and then keeps track of mismatches. And if it detects a mismatch, then it disinhibits other emotional and motivational centers. And that's the beginning of your response to the unknown. So one of them is the hypothalamus. I'm going to concentrate on it for a bit. It's a little tiny part of the brain that's pretty much at the top of the spinal cord. See, it's really small compared to the rest of the brain. Now, it turns out that imagine this is a cat brain for a minute, and you take off the whole cat brain, except for the hypothalamus, which people do. You take off the whole cortex, for example. And then the cat's still alive if you do it carefully, but it doesn't have much of a brain, and so you might think, well, that cat would just do nothing. But cat's actually pretty functional if it's reduced just to its hypothalamus. And that's because the hypothalamus is an incredibly important part of the brain, and it provides what I would say constitute the major frames, the major psychological frames. And so like a decorticate cat can still eat and drink and regulate its body temperature and engage in defensive aggression. And if it's female, it can still mate. Male can't, because the male mating behavior is more complicated. And as long as you keep it in a bounded environment, it can function reasonably well. It's hyper curious though, which is very weird, because you wouldn't expect a cat with no brain to be curious about anything, but a cat with no brain is curious about everything. And that seems to be because part of the reason that you aren't curious about something anymore is because you've investigated it, and you've built a representation of it that's functional, and that functional representation then stands for the thing itself, and then you can ignore it. And so you learn to ignore things. They're interesting to begin with, and then you learn to ignore them. And so one of the things that I think artists do, if they're great artists, is remind you that there's more to things than you see now that you've learned to ignore them. So you get a kind of a hallucinogenic painting of flowers like Van Gogh might produce, like his famous irises, which I think sold for like $220 million or something outrageous. It's like what Van Gogh is trying to show you is what those flowers looked like before you thought you could see them, because now you flower and you walk by, you know. You don't see it at all because you're off to get a peanut butter sandwich or something. You don't have time to glory in the wonder of the world, you know. You've got something practical to do. So, all right, so we're going to zoom in on the hypothalamus here. And what you see, of course, when you zoom in on the hypothalamus is that it's not a thing. It's a whole bunch of things, and then it's one of those horrible whole bunches of things that are made out of even more bunches of things, and they're made out of more bunches of things. And what's really interesting about going down the body from an analytic perspective is it doesn't seem to get less complex as you go farther down, you know, like some of the, I should actually show you that. I haven't showed you that little video of DNA fixing itself, eh? Oh, I better show you that. It's so cool. It's ridiculously cool, so you definitely need to see it. So, like, that's just so ridiculously mind-blowing that it's almost unbearable. I mean, to think about that as clockwork even is a pretty strange idea, because, well, those little things walk over obstacles. It's like, how the hell does that happen? They're just molecules. So it's so cool, because when you go down, you'd think simple, but, you know. And, you know, he said at the beginning when they were taking that, when the little machines were taking that DNA apart, that he didn't show the error correcting. You know, there's other little machines that go along and see if everything's okay, and if it isn't, they cut it out and put a right piece in. It's like, yeah, things we don't understand. There's no shortage of them, that's for sure. Okay, so what I'm doing in some sense is walking you through a psychophysiological or representation of Piaget's developmental process, I would say. So I wanted to zero in on the hypothalamus because it seems to me the thing that sets the most basic frames. And so we'll go ahead with that. So you see that it's made up of all these little parts. And so it's called the hypothalamus more for convenience than because it's a homogeneous set of structures, because it's not a homogeneous set of structures. And this is something to consider very carefully when you're thinking about the terminology that psychologists use or that you might use to describe your own behavior. Because, you know, you can roughly, there is a psychology of motivation and there's a psychology of emotion, and you might think, well, emotion and motivation are categorically different entities, but they're not. In fact, there's no such thing as a uniform set of motivations, and there's no such thing as a uniform set of emotions, and the distinction between a motivation and an emotion is unclear, to say the least. And that's partly because the physiological substructures that subsume what we call motivations and what we call emotions, and it's not like there's a motivation center that's homogeneous. The closest is the hypothalamus, but it's made of structures that are qualitatively different. And then the emotions, because I have to use that descriptive terminology because we have to communicate about it somehow. There's all sorts of different structures in the brain that contribute to emotional expression, and they're not even in the same place, much less composed of identical structure or function. So, you know, we have these shorthands that we use to divide up the world, but they're awkward and untenable as the level of resolution increases. But anyways, I'm still going to go with motivation and emotion because it's a useful simplification, but you can see with the hypothalamus that there's all these, you know, complicated little subsystems in there. And then I showed you that video to show you just how complicated the subsystems are, all the way down to the, really to the molecular level. How those little machines manage what they do is completely beyond me. You know, to call it clockwork when those little things that walk can walk over obstacles. It's like clockwork does one thing, you know, only. Click, 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 click. That's all it does. No exceptions. This thing walks over obstacles to get where it's going. It's like, who knows what's going on down there. But it works well enough, so here we are, weirdly enough.